Well, so yeah, it's important to keep that in mind. Is that we may find ourselves in agreement with Roman Catholics that Christ was born of a virgin, but what they mean by that is something different than what we mean by it. We believe that she was a virgin all the way up until delivery, and then when she delivered Christ, it was perfectly normal, and Christ opened her womb, and it was a perfectly, she had childbirth pains just like everybody else, and every other woman that's ever had a child, and it was a perfectly normal delivery. In fact, what we find when we get to some of the early writers is that they considered that evidence, or their belief in that, was because they believed Jesus came all the way down. He didn't
Mm.
just come part way. He truly became a man and truly was born of a woman. And when we read some of the early writers and church fathers, they'll talk about uh, that his delivery through Mary was almost as painful as his death, because he had to open her womb, and it was painful for him because he had to squeeze through. And
Oh
I've
gosh.
never given birth to a child. I know that my wife, her last child was without an epidural, and so she knows exactly what that's like. And I know that when a child opens the womb, it really is a big deal for that child, because he's the first one through, and it can really compress the skull, which is and when my son Tanner was born, he opened he was the first to open my wife's womb, and his head looked like a sausage when it came out, because it was just, I mean, this is just what it's like. And so,
Yeah.
so, and the early writers recognized this, and what we'll find to our surprise is that they had to back off that. Some in the latter part of the fourth century had to change their story in a hurry once they realized that a new doctrine had come up, that Mary was a virgin, even in partu.
Right.
So I want to give an example. This is what you typically find, and I find this a lot with Roman Catholic apologists. Is they'll always talk about, well, yes, this has always been taught by the church. Why, as recently as the late fourth century, we have this X, Y, and Z, and we find this. There's an outfit called Biblical Catholic Apologetics, and in their article on Mary, Virgin and Ever Virgin, they have this statement under the subtitle, The Constant Faith of the Church. And this is the statement: great teachers of the church from at least the fourth century spoke of Mary as having remained a virgin throughout her life. And I think it's almost comical when you realize how often Roman Catholics have to make that point. Why, as recently as the late fourth century, this, that, or the other. And this is just one more thing. It's one more novelty from the latter part of the fourth century that Roman Catholics have tried to purvey upon the world as an apostolic doctrine. But if you can't trace it back earlier than the latter part of the fourth century, then not only is it not apostolic, but it's also misleading to say it was the constant faith of the church. And what we'll find as we go through is that it was not the constant faith of the church. And just to give you some examples, this Biblical Catholic Apologetics page says, well, look, we have Athanasius, Epiphanius, Jerome, Augustine, and Cyril of Alexandria. Well, all of these are from the late fourth century. That's their evidence for Mary being a virgin prepartum, in partu, and postpartum. And even then, you'll find that not all of them agreed that Mary remained a virgin in partu. It's a very, I mean, among the Roman Catholic teachings that are allegedly apostolic, this is one of the most, confounded and confused and torturous trait, arguments that they make, because everybody they turn to in some way disagrees with what the actual doctrine is. So now in some web pages, you're going to come across people who say, well, Irenaeus believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary, and I want to return now, and it's very important that we draw on established Roman Catholic experts in Mariology to talk about what they themselves have acknowledged. You remember last week when we talked about the Immaculate Conception, we drew on Juniper Carroll and also Olathorn as well. Both were very well respected Roman Catholic Mariologists, and they would agree that there's no real solid evidence for Mary's immaculacy or sinlessness until the latter part of the fourth century. In fact, they'd say that 377 AD was a turning point in the West, where Ambrose had introduced a novelty, but it lasts, so they said, well, we can trace it to Ambrose, and therefore it must not have been new. And the same thing here is that, well, we can trace this to the latter part of the 4th century, and therefore it must be apostolic. And that's a huge logical leap. And it's one that often even educated evangelicals will fall for. Say, wow, if we can trace it to the latter part of the 4th century, it must be true. Well, I would say, to the contrary, if you can only trace it to the latter part of the 4th century, then it's a novelty and it's not apostolic. So, but Juniper Carroll, when he is writing on the patristic tradition concerning Mary's virginity, he says, according to those authentic writings of his which have come down to us, there is nothing in these translated passages to show that Irenaeus held the permanence of Mary's virginity. So here you have a Roman Catholic mariologist, a scholar in Mariology, and he's saying, you know what? I know some people are out there saying that Irenaeus, who died in 202 AD, so he's really a 2nd century, early 3rd century scholar, patristic writer. Juniper Carroll says, you know what? We've looked at this and we just don't find anything compelling in Irenaeus to say that he held to Mary's perpetual virginity.